Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Thursday, September 19th, 2019. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the latest film and TV news. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta, and joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Weekend Editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
And Senior Writer Ben Pearson.
Hey, what's going on?
Okay, let's dive into it, guys. Let's talk about some remakes that probably shouldn't be, remakes and reboots that shouldn't be happening. Let's start things off with The Princess Bride. Ben, tell us about it.
Yeah, so apparently, in one of the worst ideas that I've heard in a long, long time, there was at Sony Pictures, there's been some threatening rumbles that somebody might actually try to remake The Princess Bride, which I think is it's definitely one of my favorite movies. It's one of, I think, the best movies ever made. It's like a perfect adventure, romance, drama. It's got like every great aspect of movie making in it. Rob Reiner directed the 1987 original, which was written by William Goldman based on his novel, which is also excellent. You should read that, even if you are a big fan of the movie. So anyway, Tony Vinciquerra, I think might be how you pronounce his last name. He's the CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment. Told Variety that we have so many people coming up to us saying we want to remake this show or that show. Very, very famous people whose names I won't use, but they want to redo The Princess Bride. So there's no, official confirmation that this is actually happening. We don't know who these famous people are. But it's safe to say that, like, the entire internet seemed to band together and scream in one voice, this is a terrible idea, don't do this. So, yeah, guys, this is a terrible idea, and they shouldn't do this, right?
I mean, I think so. Was it you that read The Princess Bride recently on a water cooler episode you talked about reading it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I will try to link that in the show notes if I can find that.
I will say this. As time has gone on, and I've come to the realization and understanding that they're probably going to remake anything and everything at some point, and it won't tarnish or ruin the original in any way whatsoever, I've come to care less because I don't have to go see that movie and I don't have to like it, and I can just go watch the original anytime I want to. And
yeah, but here's the thing, Brad. I know where you're going with this, but let me just interject really quick. It will not ruin the old thing, but then when you start talking about that old thing, people think you are talking about the new thing. Like, younger people probably, have only seen the new version of Total Recall or the new version of The Karate Kid or do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like it then becomes the conversation gets weakened.
I mean, I disagree. I think you can steer the conversation whichever way you want to, and especially if everyone agrees that it's not good, you can just disregard it. Furthermore, and I'll take whatever heat comes along with this, I think The Princess Bride is only fine.
Oh no.
Well, guys, I'm hanging up and calling it a day. So
don't get me wrong, thoroughly entertaining, very charming. This is not a movie that I grew up watching, and I think a big part of the love for this movie comes from nostalgia and people who grew up watching it as kids. Because while I think that it's funny, and it has a very clever script, and the performances are good, and it does a wonderful job of creating this meta fairy tale, I just don't think that it's the perfect movie that everyone thinks it does.
I mean, I'm not a person that loves Princess Bride. Princess Bride is one of Kitcher's favorite films. But I do like it a lot, and I do think it's one of those things that it is not amazing, but the execution of it is. Do you know what I mean? Like, all the things that involved that you pointed out. Like, the people involved. Like, I think it was lightning in a bottle. Like, it's... I don't think it would be easy to replicate because it's not like the story is amazing.
Sure, but I mean,
guys, I can't even believe that I'm hearing this. I'm like flipping things over in my room right now.
Wait. So you think the source material as itself is like incredible, and that's why The Princess Bride is a great movie, not the execution of it?
I think it's all of the above, man. I think as everything that you guys, I think all of what you guys have said is true in that the casting and the alchemy of those people in that moment brought together in that way, and the execution is perfect. But I also think the script is just so good, and yeah, I think the source material is fantastic. I think it's going to be really, really difficult to be able to if Brad is true and this inevitably does get remade down the line, I think it's just going to be so tough to find that same type of the source material is so good, but I just don't know if that magic is going to exist in it anymore.
I mean, I think we can agree upon that. Maybe it's not a remake. Maybe it's a reboot, and maybe Fred Savage is going to come back and he's going to be the father reading the story.
I kind of hate myself for saying this, but that might be an interesting thing that I might be interested in, because then you could have maybe him telling what he presumes to be the same story. Maybe he lost the book, right? And he tries to tell the story based on his own memory of it, and it's different because memory is interesting.
It sounds like there's a good idea for a Princess Bride remake, man, isn't there?
But it's not really a remake, though, right? It's like I
guess
it kind of it's like parsing. You're dealing with semantics at that point. But if it's just a straight remake, I don't think I would be interested. But if it was something that sort of played with the iconography of it in a way, then yeah, sure, I could see being intrigued by that.
Okay, let's move on to another reboot. This one for the Peacock, which we talked about on yesterday's podcast. And this is a reboot of The Office. Brad, what's going on here?
Well, Peacock, the awesomely named streaming service coming from NBC, have been unloading all the new shows that they're considering making and the ones that they have in development. And apparently one of them is a reboot of The Office. NBC Universal's chairman of direct-to-consumer and digital enterprises, Bonnie Hammer, says, "It is my hope and goal that we do an Office reboot." No, just no. I mean, first of all, you do an Office reboot, it's no matter what, it's always going to be compared to what came before, and you're never going to create a show that is as satisfying as the first show, that doesn't feel like it's desperately trying to cling to what came before it. And like, what story are you going to tell?
Wait a second. I have to interject here, because isn't The Office itself a reboot?
Yes, but what's
because you're making it sound like it can't be done. A reboot of The Office cannot be successful, but it was.
But again, though, what makes The Office in the U.S. great is when it started veering away from what the British Office was. The first season of the American Office is bad because it tries to just replicate exactly what Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant did with the British Office. When The Office in the U.S. gets really good is when it starts becoming its own show. And that's really halfway through season 2 and then into season 3 and 4 are like the best seasons of that series. And so, yes, a remake of The Office does work, but this is not this wouldn't be that. I guarantee you there would be some kind of connective tissue where Dunder Mifflin is still up and running, but there's like mostly an entirely new staff or something like that. And we just don't need it, especially since the show is still extremely popular today. Everyone's still watching the original U.S. Office, and people are still discovering it today because it's available in streaming. So this is just not something that needs to be done right now. Like,
but Brad, someone once told me that a new reboot of it will not ruin the original.
No, but it's not. This isn't about ruining the original though. This is about the fact that it's too soon.
It's too
soon. I feel like maybe in 10 years, sure, go back and revisit The Office. But right now is not the time.
In a second, I want to get Ben's reaction to this. I can say I do not watch sitcoms, and I'm one of probably the few people in this world that has not watched The Office. I've seen a couple episodes. I've seen a few episodes. Yeah, I don't. You call me the comedy curmudgeon, so I am the comedy curmudgeon.
Peter.
Okay, yes, I know. Kitcher gives me crap about it all the time, but this doesn't sound like too bad of an idea because, and I'll tell you why. Because I think like the premise of The Office is conducive of like rebooting. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's an office comedy set up as a documentary crew following them, and that's literally all you really need to do for it. And you just replace with a new cast of great comedic talent. Now that's hard to do, is finding the new cast of comedic talent. I'm not going to make that sound like that's easy to do. I mean, look at Saturday Night Live has been trying to do that for 20 years, but
that's another thing altogether. just don't talk about Saturday Night Live. You have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay.
But with the Office, what makes it special isn't the premise. It's Part of it is the cast, but part of it is also more so is the characters and how they develop and change. And I feel like they told so many different kinds of stories with this U.S. version of The Office that lasted for 9 seasons that you're going to have a hard time digging into something that feels refreshing, that doesn't feel like it's walking the same territory that they already did with the NBC's version of The Office.
Ben, were you a big fan of The Office?
I was, and then I wasn't. I ended up not finishing the show. I think I jumped off like somewhere in the 7th, 8th season. When Jim started to become like a totally different character, I just sort of lost interest in the show because I thought they were really doing him nasty, and I don't know. I just didn't find it. I found it like the show was falling into a rut for me, and it just got to the point where I wasn't enjoying the episodes anymore, so I just bailed on it late, and then I came back and watched like maybe the last 3 episodes in a row or something, like before the series finale. But I when I loved the show, I really loved it. It was one of my favorite things on TV, and I just find it interesting that Brad seems to be on the opposite end of the fence, on this argument in terms of remakes and stuff, than he was on The Princess Bride. But I think you've done a decent enough job. Well, yeah, and I think you've done a decent enough job explaining why, but it's just sort of interesting to have what ostensibly seems to be 2 similar conversations back to back and 2 wildly opposing viewpoints right after the other. But
I mean, the other thing is, like, I agree with you. I don't think it's worth rebooting The Office by having the same characters and storylines play out again in a different way. Like, I don't think that is a good idea in any way. But I feel like the idea of an Office comedy, documentary style, mockumentary style, whatever you want to call it, is like a good thing to possibly reboot. And you could do it in different ways. You could do it in an office, then like it could be like almost like a Silicon Valley, like Apple tech company like office, and it could be like totally different, and it's
but just do what networks have been doing for years and make a new workplace comedy.
But like, don't you think the name brand recognition is so important to NBC Universal that's why they would basically do what you're saying, make a whole separate type of show? But
they already did that. It's called Parks and Recreation.
Yeah, Brad,
I know,
they need people to subscribe to something called Peacock, so this is how they're going to do it. Okay, talking about companies with subscription services, let's talk about Disney and Apple, which apparently in an alternate universe where Steve Jobs were still alive, they might have likely merged. Ben, tell us about it.
Yeah, so Bob Iger is about to produce an autobiography called The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons from 15 Years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company. And Vanity Fair published an excerpt from this autobiography in which he basically talks about his relationship with Apple co-founder Steve Jobs. And his quote here is, "I believe that if Steve were still alive, we would have combined our companies, or at least discussed the possibility very seriously." There have been rumors about a Disney-Apple merger sort of swirling for years and years. Steve Jobs died back in 2011, and those rumors were around that time because Bob Iger was on the board of Apple, and Steve Jobs was a big part of Disney as soon as Pixar got sort of brought into that fold as well. Actually, as recently as 2017, there were some talks that Disney and Apple might merge, and it wouldn't be like the merger that you might expect, because Disney seems to be, on top of the entertainment world right now. But back in 2017, they were actually talking about Apple being the one to buy Disney for something like $200 billion. I guess I just assumed it would have been Disney buying Apple, but Apple's the one who has all this money to spend. Obviously, things would be wildly different if that happened, because this merger probably would have happened long before talks of Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus, even long before AT&T bought Time Warner. So, it likely could have totally reshaped what we know of as the entertainment landscape today.
Yeah, I'm an OG Apple fanatic from way back, and I like to imagine, like, what would Steve Jobs have done? Like, would we have the Apple Watch that we now have? Like, he was talking about, when he was on his deathbed, he was talking about how they had figured out how Apple could re-envision the television, and that got abandoned after his death. So it'll be a crazy different world if Steve Jobs were still alive.
And like maybe a worse one because Disney is already like super powerful. And can you imagine, with them like Disney having Apple's tech infrastructure on top of all the stuff they already have? Like think about just Apple TV Plus and Disney Plus combined. That is like that's I don't know if and this may have happened, theoretically right around the time that Netflix was beginning to sort of establish its own dominance in the streaming field. And if this Disney Apple merged company, if they joined forces, maybe they could have, stifled Netflix in some way, beat them at their own game, with the combination of all of their powers and stuff like that. I think it's kind of wild to think about.
Yeah, it's crazy because you have these conversations about how like the littlest thing can change the world, and it's hard to really imagine that that's true. But like, the death of one person could really change the outcome of this world in a big way. Anyways, talking about Disney, we've been talking about Disney and what they're doing with Fox. They may have not even acquired Fox if that had happened, but they did acquire Fox, and they have been saying since that acquisition that they are excited to have Fox Searchlight and that award division, and they're gonna use them and foster good talent and movies from that division. We've all been kind of skeptical, but it seems like that might be true because they have signed on their first post-acquisition big director. Brad, what do we know?
Fox Searchlight is still going strong over at Disney, despite the fact that Disney has been stifling 20th Century Fox a little bit more based on their poor box office returns for the movies they had set for release this year. But Fox Searchlight made a new acquisition. Announced today they picked up Wes Anderson's next movie, which is called The French Dispatch. It's a movie we'd been hearing about for a little while as new cast members were added all the time earlier this year. An official press release today announced that they will be distributing it worldwide. There's no release date yet, but they did confirm that the cast does indeed include Benicio del Toro, Frances McDormand, Jeffrey Wright, Adrian Brody, Timothée Chalamet, Lea Seydoux, Tilda Swinton, Matthew Almaric, Lina Kudry, Stephen Park, Owen Wilson, and Bill Murray. However, there are some cast members that we previously heard about that are not mentioned in this press release, including Saoirse Ronan, Willem Dafoe, Henry Winkler, Kate Winslet, Jason Schwartzman, Bob Balaban, and Christoph Waltz. All of those people were reported to be in the French Dispatch, but are not listed in this cast list. And that could very well be because maybe they have smaller parts than the rest of those cast members. Even when, Wes Anderson has a movie that is based around an ensemble cast, which they pretty much all are, there are still other bit parts that are played by actors who aren't necessarily considered to be like a key part of the cast. So there's a good chance that these actors could still be in the movie, but maybe their parts are smaller than those listed in the press release, especially since the movie has been said to follow 3 different storylines as a collection of stories that are published in this magazine called The French Dispatch. And the movie itself is said to be a love letter to journalists that's set in an outpost of an American newspaper in a fictional 20th century French city. So, yeah, it's always good when you get a new Wes Anderson movie. Fox Searchlight has been releasing plenty of Wes Anderson's movies over the years, including Isle of Dogs and Fantastic Mr. Fox, The Grand Budapest Hotel. So they've got a long history, and, any Wes Anderson movie is good news.
Yeah, and him making a movie with a big, awesome cast is like not surprising at all. I do think that him, reuniting with Fox Searchlight, and actually this is kind of a homecoming of sorts because Wes Anderson started his career, I think, with Touchstone Pictures. Like they were owned by Disney, and they produced, I think, Rushmore, maybe even Bottle Rocket. I'm not sure. So there's that. Let's talk about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's a sequel in development. Ben, what do we know?
Yeah, so Bloody Disgusting has a report that says that Fede Alvarez, the director behind Don't Breathe and the Evil Dead remake from a few years ago, is on board to produce a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel for Legendary Pictures. They say, while plans aren't set in stone, we're hearing that the hope is to make a direct sequel to Tobe Hooper's 1974 film, similar to what Blumhouse and Universal have done with Halloween. Yeah, so they said that it'll be interesting to see how they continue the story without Marilyn Burns, who's the original final girl in the very first movie, who passed away in 2014. But they say that this potential sequel could focus on the current state of the fictional Sawyer family. Or actually, I don't even know if the Sawyer family is fictional. I've never actually done like a deep dive into the differences between the real life story that inspired this and the the liberties that the film franchise has taken. So the Sawyer family may be real, but anyway, guys, a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. I'm not sure. I'm not completely sold on this. I like Alvarez, but the only movie he's ever produced has been Don't Breathe, which is his own movie. So his involvement doesn't really give us much of anything to go on there. I don't know. I think for me, it's like, unless we're seeing a totally different take on this material from somebody with a completely different perspective than what we've seen before, it sort of seems like more of the same to me with a new Leatherface movie. What do you guys think?
I mean, I think if as long as it's going to be a remake, I'm all for it. I love remakes. Remakes are my jam. They're my favorite thing. No, I honestly though, specifically, I think horror is probably the best genre that lends itself to doing reboots and remakes. Because people, especially when it comes to franchises like Texas Chainsaw, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Friday the 13th, there are certain staples and things that they want to see from those franchises, and they don't care that they get repeated or used over and over again. But they also like to see filmmakers with a different style approach it and kind of give it a little bit of a makeover. So like a lot of horror remakes, I think, dabble in dealing with a little bit of nostalgia, also bringing something new to the table. And so I think it's with something like this, it's fine if they're not necessarily bringing, a complete overhaul to the franchise in order to please the fans, but also, get something that interests the new generation as well.
See, I've only seen the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I've seen the remake that was done like 20 years ago or whenever. So I don't know. I don't really have a love for this franchise, but it seems like another remakeable thing to me. Like, this crazy like it seems like the source material that this is supposedly based on or whatever, the vagueness of that, like it seems like something that is repeatable with that brand name. But I think
so too. And then there's also the whole like, hey, forget most of this franchise happened approach that they've done in Halloween and Superman Returns and Terminator movies and stuff like that too. So it seems like they're just picking and choosing the things that they really like. And if it's a direct sequel to the original movie, that's well before Matthew McConaughey gets involved and like all the craziness that happens later on in the franchise. So maybe they'll be able to appeal to the hardcore fans that way too, by just sort of eschewing all of the stuff that isn't quite as beloved as that original film.
Yes, and I want to have a correction. Bottle Rocket was released by Sony Pictures, but Wes Anderson did have a career at Touchstone Pictures with Rushmore, Royal Tenenbaums, Life Aquatic, before making his way over to Fox Searchlight with Darjeeling Limited. So there you go. Okay. Anyways, let's move on to our final story. This one, I guess, has a spoiler warning because we're going to be talking about Toy Story 4 and the ending of that movie. So if you have not seen that movie, you might want to tune out now because we're going to be talking about an alternate ending, which sounds pretty awful. Brad, tell us about it.
Yes, so Toy Story 4 kind of surprised all of us by being this movie that somehow brought a more satisfying conclusion to the Toy Story franchise, or at least a character story in the overall franchise, more so than Toy Story 3 did. A lot of people were naysayers, myself included, about whether or not Toy Story 4 was even necessary, and the story at the center of it really kind of took me by surprise and touched my heart, and I felt like was a worthy send-off for Woody, who has been at the center of this franchise in every single movie and has had quite an interesting journey as, a toy who has gone from growing up with a boy to being handed off to a little girl. And at the end of Toy Story 4, realizes that maybe he needs to have a life of his own outside of simply being a kid's plaything. And he comes to that realization thanks to Bo Peep, who is a porcelain doll who was also part of a lamp that Andy's sister Molly had when she was a kid. And Andy had played with this with Bo Peep even before Molly came around in Toy Story 2. But at some point, Bo Peep was given away because Molly didn't want the lamp anymore. And Woody runs into her in Toy Story 4, finds out she's been living a life on her own without living with any kids, but still occasionally getting played with and whatnot. And so he realizes that he can go and have his own life away from Bonnie. But the ending that Pixar considered at one point was when after Woody and Bo Peep were celebrating in the carnival after finding a home for Gabby with a girl who was lost at the carnival, Bo Peep suddenly sees Harmony, who is the little girl that they initially tried to get Gabby to go home with, but ended up not being interested in the doll. And somehow she suddenly realizes that Harmony is this new kid that she wants to go home with. Says that she's the one for her now, and it just feels very forced. It feels like it comes out of nowhere, and there's a good chance that if this ending ended up in the movie, that there might have been other scenes that preceded it.
Yeah, they could have set it up in some way.
Yeah, exactly. But as it stands in the cut of Toy Story 4 that we see, Bo Peep doesn't have a connection with Harmony at all, and so it kind of comes out of nowhere. And in a way, it almost would have been kind of a slap in the face to Gabby, because if Harmony doesn't want Gabby, and then Bo Peep thinks, oh, well, I'll go with this kid because she wants me probably. And then it also calls into question, what would have happened to Woody? Would he have learned this lesson from Bo Peep about going to live his own life? And then as she goes to live with a kid all of a sudden, would he still have gone on his own, or would he have gone back to Bonnie? Would he have tried to go with Bo Peep, with Harmony? It's there's no explanation by Josh Cooley except that he does say that this ending did come close to happening. So whoever vetoed this ending, please give them a raise, because it made Toy Story 4 infinitely better for it.
I mean, we do have to acknowledge that throughout the Pixar process, the story changes a lot. Like,
True.
What they started with is completely different than what they ended with, and usually, the movie changes completely, probably 5-6 times throughout that whole process. But you said this is something that was in the cut near the end, which is also not something untypical of Pixar. They some of the biggest moments have been last-minute changes that they've made, but somehow that company, I guess you could argue that Good Dinosaur did not succeed in maybe Brave, but aside from those, the track record of stories from that company is unmatched. And Ben, what would you have thought of this ending?
God, I'm so glad they didn't do that. I mean, it is hard to say, because like you guys were saying, we don't know how well they could have seeded those ideas in, but based on what we have, I mean, that is so antithetical to everything that Bo Peep stands for in the movie that exists as it, in its current form. And like Brad said, it would have just left Woody in this really, really weird place where, he learns the lesson, and you feel for him as an audience member in the current version, but you kind of feel like things are going to be okay because he's with Bo and he's with Ducky and Bunny at the end. But I don't know if you would have had that same feeling if he wasn't with Bo at the end. I think they would have had to do some serious massaging of the story to have that be a satisfying ending or something that paid off in a way that was even close to what they ended up coming up with.
It's also a little bit of a strange change of pace, because isn't it like the human kid that's supposed to choose the toy, not the toy that chooses the human?
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. Anyways, okay. Well, you can read more of all the stories we mentioned on today's podcast linked in the show notes and on slashfilm.com. This podcast, Slash Film Daily, is published every weekday on iTunes, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please feel free to send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns to us at peter@slashfilm.com. We've been getting lots of emails about the joke book, and it is not one-sided. I will tell you, I will say that much so far. So, it's still open for entries, peter@slashfilm.com. Please rate and read this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends, spread the word, and we'll see you tomorrow.
I think a better alternate ending for Toy Story 4, Peter, you just, raised this notion in my mind, might have been if if Bo Peep was like, that's the little girl, that's the one that I want, and then tried to present herself to the girl, and the girl's just like, nah, moved on, and that was it.
That could have been the after credits scene.
Yeah, exactly.